This is WordPress St. Petersburg, improving WordPress performance. This is John Biddle. He's going to be doing our talk tonight. And here you go. Here's your little controls, left and right. Have fun,
The right side is forward.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay. Improving WordPress performance. Everybody in the right place? I do have some handouts on your way out or after we're finished. There's nothing really in them except a whole bunch of links that further explain this stuff. Mostly this presentation is about what to do and not so much exactly how to do it. That would be a day presentation, not an hour presentation. Just some caveats here. Performance tuning is complex. I'm not going to cover everything. You probably already know that, but nonetheless, I'll just tell you up front. Even the topics that I do cover, I'm not going to cover all the details, but I hopefully will point in the handout to more detail where you can go read more of what you're interested in. Another thing is that every site is different. What the most important thing to improve site A might not matter to the person on site B. Something else might make a huge difference to them. That has to do with what's in your site, and it has to do with what you've already done. So if you've already done, for example, image compression, then you're not going to get much more from what I teach you or show you about image compression, but somebody who hasn't could gain a huge amount from that. And the same thing about all the other stuff here. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. I will try to hit all the big topics, though. All right. Why is performance important? Well, you probably already know that, but people care. People don't want to go to slow sites. You've been to sites, you know that's true. You don't want to sit around waiting for the pages to move. People's attention span has dropped. There's a lot about, especially younger people. You hear that all the time, but it's cut almost in half in the last 15, 16 years. A 1-second page delay can result in loss of conversions, fewer page views, and decreases in customer satisfaction. Now, this is a misleading statistic here a little bit, because is that a 1-second delay from 15 seconds down to 14 or from 2 seconds down to 1, right? They're not the same. So I guess this is some kind of average stat, right? Because, but nonetheless, and the idea, 3 seconds here, half your users are already thinking about leaving. That doesn't mean half do leave, but half are already thinking about it by that point. And you don't want to get to that point. You want to be below that. And Google penalizes slower websites now in a very small way, but that probably will get bigger as time goes on. So that your ability to benefit from a fast website is only going to get bigger as time goes on. How fast is fast enough? Well, you really want every page, if possible, to be 2 seconds or less. That's it. That's, kind of, you can think of that as a minimum standard for a fast website. If you don't care, if you don't think your customers care, fine. But 2 seconds per page is where that's really a minimum. A really good performing website would be a second, for a page. It's possible. It isn't necessarily true. Some pages are never going to get that fast, but you can get surprisingly close if you give it, the right effort. And as far as how much difference is noticeable, Google said it takes 400 milliseconds before people can see the difference. And Microsoft says, no, they can see the difference at 250 milliseconds. So if you make a change and it only improves things 200 milliseconds, you want to say, I don't need to do that. Well, that might be true. Maybe nobody could see it. But it's also true that you might have 7 or 8 different changes that you could make, each of which might be 100, 150, 200 milliseconds. And you add them up and you're well over a second, which is huge. So it's not unimportant for changes that are only 150, 200 milliseconds. If it's because they are mostly additive. They're not, they don't take each other's place. As far as what to measure, one thing that's real important here, and it's very misleading, is you want to measure page load time, right? Not a fancy number. All of these different, and I'll get to them later, but all the different measurement tools will give you a magic number or a grade. You got an A, you got a B, you got a B, a C minus, whatever. That stuff is not really important. What's important is, does it load in a second? Does it load in a second and a half? Does it load in 2 seconds? Time is what's important. You can find that you can spend hours on the Google site in particular and improve your number from, I went from 85 to 96, wow! And the website went from 1.2 seconds to 1.3 seconds. The most important thing is time, not the magic number. Some techniques increase fragility. You want to be careful. And I'll try to point out here which ones those are. But you don't want to sacrifice your website's functionality for speed and when I say fragility, I mean stability. You don't want to break your website in order to get faster. Again, from a performance perspective, faster isn't, excuse me, if it isn't faster, it isn't better. That from a performance perspective, right? The grade doesn't matter, it's whether it's fast or not. But there's more to a good website than performance. And you have to keep that in mind. You don't want to get that focus of, oh, performance is the only thing, because that is not true, right? You want to have the website that delivers what your customers need, but quickly, not the other way around. Where to test, these are the 4 main testing applications. Ping them, they're all on the web, they're all free. They're not in any particular order, although the Google Page Speed Insights is the one that's most notorious about giving you a magic number that is less, is not tied very well to actual performance, right? They'll tell you 50 things that you can do to improve your website from a technical perspective, but you don't always get faster when you do them. And you might, in many of the cases, create a more fragile website as you do that. How to test, mainly you want to be thinking about trying to test away from your production environment. Test in your dev site or test in a staging site. But there are issues with that, right? Because the dev site is usually a little bit different than your production site, even if it has all the same data in it. I know I found out, for example, I host with the SiteGround, and I found out that there are certain things that they do in production that they don't do in the test site, I mean your staging site. And so you can't test that because it isn't there. You expect that they're the same, but you might get a 1 second performance on the production site, and the same site in staging might be a 1.5 seconds. And I didn't make any changes at all, but that's because they don't support compression, for example. And the same thing is true if you have a dev site locally. Your dev site locally is not exactly the same. But you can test there and then figure, okay, this looks really good, then move it over to production and try it there, right? But try to do everything as much as you can away from production. But you do need to validate in production. Test different kinds of pages. I think this is important. People have a tendency to test their main page. You put in your domain name and it goes to your home page and you test the heck out of that and you're done. No, not even close. You want to be testing all the different kinds of pages. Not every page, but the different kinds of pages. For example, you want to test your blog page if your blog page is different from your home page. You want to test a single blog page, right? But one post. Just pick one that's got a bunch of comments and a bunch of photographs, right? Images. Any non-standard pages you have, pages that use a lot of JavaScript or use a lot of plugins. For example, you might have a page that's a FAQ, and you have all fancy, like where you click on it and it opens up with the answer, and then you click on it again and it closes, all that kind of, that accordion type stuff. But, so that's different. That's something you want to test that page if you can. Also, you can use your analytics to tell to figure out what are your most popular pages and what are your slowest pages, and fix those. It's also the case that if you start with your slowest pages, and you'll fix a bunch of things, and you'll find that those same fixes affect all your other pages. That's one thing, is you don't have to fix the same item on all the different pages. When you fix something, it's fixed across your site. So if you start with one where the page is already really slow, as you fix all the different things that make it slow, all the other pages that get slow because of those things, they get fixed automatically. So it isn't as big a deal as you might think. You don't have to go through all the different pages. Also, when you use these tools, you run a test once, that's not your number, right? Because these tests take place over the internet, and the internet is different all the time, right? Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast. Also, your server, typically, unless you have a dedicated server where you're the only one on it, every time you use it is different, because you might have as many as 1,000 other websites on that same server. And those websites may be busy or they may be quiet at the moment, and it makes a huge difference in terms of testing. So you want to do a number of tests. It's tedious. It takes 10 seconds, 20, 30 seconds for the page to do the testing. and give you the result. And so you test it once and twice and 3 times and 4 times. You're going to do a lot of testing. You might think, that takes too long. But you want a minimum of 3. 5 is probably better to get an accurate idea. Because if you're looking at something that's only going to save you 100 milliseconds and the variation is 200 or 300 milliseconds from test to test, you know that you're going to have to do a bunch of those before you even know whether or not your test is positive or not. Is this actually improving my site, or is it making it worse? You only also want to compare the tests with the same parameters. You can't do a test with GTmetrix and do a different test on the same page with the Google product and then compare them, because they don't work the same way. They won't give you the same results. The numbers are not comparable. You can test the Google versus Google, or GTmetrix versus GTmetrix, or Pingdom versus Ping. That's fine. But you need to test the same product against itself. The same thing is true when you set the products up. They'll give you the chance to say, well, what browser do you want to test with? And what server of ours do you want to test against, right? Do you want to run against the server in Amsterdam, or do you want to run against the server in Chicago? You pick. It doesn't matter which one you pick so much as to use the same one all the time, because you're going to get very different results if you test against Chicago and test against Amsterdam, right? So you want to be paying attention to that. You want to get a baseline. You want to keep track of all this information, put it in a spreadsheet or, whatever, put it on a piece of paper, I don't care, but keep track of it. And then you pick something, all right, I want to make this change, right? And you make the change, and then you compare, you evaluate it, you test it, you document it, make sure, oh, this is what I have, this is the change that I got. And then if you're satisfied, you can go on. If you're not satisfied, this either isn't enough, or I don't know yet whether this is good enough. Maybe I'm testing caching programs and there's 3 or 4 of them I think I want. I don't know which one. Or I'm testing image optimization. I don't know which way I want to go. So even if you're satisfied, that, yeah, I got a good performance out of this, but maybe it's not the best one, then you undo that and then test again to validate that when you undid it, you went back to where you started from. And then redo the test again with the new product or the new change that you made, and then go that route. Keep doing it until you figured out, okay, well, how do I want to do image compression, or how do I want to do this kind of thing, or how do I want to do that? And then establish that. Now you got a new baseline, and then you can go on and do the next one. This is a screen. This is GTmetrix, but it's just an example screen. The red circle on the left there, those are your magic numbers, right? In this case, it shows you the page speed score and the Y slow score. Those are just 2 different products about how they evaluate which things are important and which things you should fix, which things they think are slowing your website down. I mean, it's almost impossible for people not to pay attention to that stuff, especially I got an A, I got a 91. But that is, again, that's not the important thing. The important thing over there is in the blue circle, that 1.7 seconds. Oh, by the way, this is for TampaBayWP.org, okay? And I got numbers from 1.9 to 0.9. on the same test. Just click, 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 and the numbers were 2 to 1 in terms of performance.
Well, we had A's.
So, but you did get an A. All right, the next 2 numbers are also important, the total page size and the requests, right? In the sense that when you decrease your total page size, you're making progress, right? Because smaller is better. Requests, sometimes smaller is better. Sometimes it doesn't matter. It depends. I'll get into the details of that. But depending on which technologies you use, it's either irrelevant or it's important. There's never the case that smaller is worse. It's just, but it might not be better to go from 50 to 45, for example. On the bottom there, the green, you see there's a bunch of different tabs. The page speed tab, the Y slow tab. Those are just the 2 different ways that's connected to the 2 magic numbers up there on the left. And then you've got a waterfall tab, which breaks down every single request that's made for this page and how long it took and what the breakdown of that thing is. That's a lot of technical information you can use, but anyway, that's what that's for. And then the green arrows up in the upper left right-hand corner point to user settings, and the retest button, they point to the test server region and the browser that you're using. So that's where you would check to see that you're using the right ones. Again, it's not so much which one you use, just use the same one all the time. This is the same page, but these little toggles up here, I don't have a pointer, these little toggles up here, the little triangles pointing up and down, are basically detail or no detail, right? You want the summary number, is this good or bad? And then if you want to look and see, well, why was that the case, you click on that little triangle and it opens up all the detail underneath and it'll tell you these are the specific things that mattered in this particular case, right? Also, the circle in the middle there with the red and the green arrows pointing up or down, in this case, what that means is this page better than the average page on the web, or is this worse than the average page on the web for this particular characteristic? Yes, sir. The red button?
Yeah. Somewhere in there.
I pushed the red button, nothing happened.
There it is.
Oh,
Hold it down.
oh, you have to hold it down.
Yeah.
This button right here.
You got it, yeah.
I'm holding it down, nothing's happening.
See it down below.
Yeah,
Oh, there it is. I just wasn't close. Okay, this is your compared to other pages on the web. Am I better than average or am I worse than average on this one particular thing, not on the whole page? And then this circle up here, this is a little bit different. This is the priority. So this is a function of this particular tool thinks these things are high priority. They're the things that this tool is going to give you the most credit for if you fix them and show you that that you've improved. But again, priority from them in terms of making your magic number higher, not necessarily making your your speed higher. But it's a good place to start. If you don't know which things are really important, try work on the things that are where it says high. Okay. Some basic principles about this. Total performance. You got back-end performance and you got front-end performance, and they both matter, and they can both be a big deal. You want, basically, that boils down to, you want to avoid sending something if you can, right? The fastest thing that you can send is something you don't have to send. You want to send the least, meaning the smallest. If you can send the same photo with 3.2 megs or 50K, then you want to send the 50K version, right? Send from a closer location. That's the CDN. You want to, if your users are in the United States and your web server is in Chicago, that's great. But if they're in Europe and your web server's in Chicago and you have an option to have a web server in Paris, you're going to be much better off, they are anyway, if they're pulling all their static stuff from the Paris server and only pulling the minimum that they have to from your Chicago server. And that's what CDNs do. We'll talk about the details later. You want to use modern technologies. I'll get into what that means later. Turn off things you don't use. Seems pretty simple, but there are lots and lots of pieces of WordPress that most people don't use, but they're there constantly. It's how, taking up cycles. And also focus on apparent speed, not actual speed. We'll get to that also. Backend performance. I'm not talking about the WordPress admin versus your actual pages now. I'm talking about the server versus the browser. That's what I mean by backend and front end. You want to use quality hosting. As far as the backend is concerned, the quality hosting makes a lot of difference. Improving and focusing on improving a crappy server is, you're just never going to be successful. You're not going to be happy. Server response time is the thing that you need to focus on when you're talking about, is my server doing a good job or not? There's a reference in the handouts to how to get that actual number, right? You want to turn on HTTP compression, GZIP, right? And also set expires headers. Those are done in the server, even though some people can say, well, that's really a function of the desktop, especially the expires headers. That means how the cache in your workstation or your phone is how it functions, but you control it at the server end. You want to implement page caching, which is what most people think of when they get a WordPress cache. That's the cache we're talking about, even though there are more than one kind of cache. And then you want to use a quality optimized theme. I don't get into which ones to get. You can do your research, but all themes are not equal. And I'm not talking about how they look, but how they perform. Are they well coded? Are they fast? Right? Are they full of all kinds of junk or not?
Could you,
yes, sir.
Just on the WordPress dates, like 2011, 2012, 2017,
yes.
Is there something that you've noticed that's different significantly on performance?
No, I couldn't tell you about the performance on any of those. And I don't mean to be abrupt, but I'm going to run through this really as fast as I can, and I got a lot of stuff, so please hold your questions to the end.
And all the slides will be online too. So.
Yeah, you'll have access to the slides, and you can have a copy of the handouts. I'll also send them a copy of the handout. We'll put the handouts online as well. The again, fine-tune a piece of crap is wasted effort, but remember, good hosting doesn't have to be expensive. It isn't a case that you get what you pay for. You can pay a lot and not get a lot. You can pay a little and get a lot. You just have to be careful, and you have to pay attention to what you need. There are lots of good hosting articles out there to read about what, how to figure out which is a good host and which is not, but please be careful in that regard. Most hosting surveys and most articles about hosting are affiliate linked, and they'll tell you whatever they need to get you to buy the affiliate that pays them. So just keep that in mind, all right? There's lots of data on the web for the research, just like everything else, but pay attention. Again, good sources of info when they hand out, but I'm not saying those are the best sources of info, just some good ones that I found. You may find better ones, you don't need to take this as gospel. I tried to find stuff that would give you different perspectives. So the same website or the same host doesn't appear as number one in each of the links I gave you, all right? Also, talk to your friends, talk to people here who have websites. What's your experience? You've had this site, this host for a year. What do you think of them? Performance is important, but performance isn't the only thing. Do they answer your questions when you need help? Is the uptime good? There's lots of things that make a good host that aren't just performance. GZIP Compression, again, you might not be able to see all the details here, but this is the kind of stuff, this section right here, you stick that in your htaccess file, and that turns on GZIP compression if the browser of the end user supports it, right? And it will turn it on. Each one of those lines says, turn it on for this kind of file, turn it on for that kind of file, turn it on for this kind of file. And so you include them all, and then when your customer comes to your website, if they have a browser that's anywhere near current, they will support GZIP, and they'll negotiate, okay, great, GZIP, and then your HTML files will go down at more than twice as fast. Set expires headers. This is another batch of text lines that you put in the htaccess file. What this does is it tells the browser how long to keep items in the cache before they're expired. So you go to a website and you bring down all the little pieces, right, that make up that page. Each one of those pieces gets cached in the browser's cache. Obviously, every individual user can have different size caches, so they may hold a lot of stuff, they may hold a little stuff, but it all goes in the cache. The next time they come back to that page, the browser looks in its cache and says, do I have all this stuff? And each piece that it has locally, it wants to use, but it doesn't know if those pieces are current, because the website on the server may have changed. So it compares the expired date with the date of what's on the server, what's on the workstation in the cache, and says, is what I have expired yet? If it's not expired, it uses what's in your local cache. If it's been expired, it goes out to the web and brings back a copy, even if it hasn't changed, because it doesn't know it's changed. It just knows I need to go get a new copy because it might have changed, right? That can create some issues for you. You would think, well, if that's the case, why don't you just make these numbers really big so it never has to go back to the server? But what happens when you change your CSS file? And the customer continues to get the old one because that's the one in the cache, right? And to fix that, it means you need to change the name of your CSS file, right? Because otherwise, it will always go to the one in the cache until it expires. So you have the balancing act of maybe don't make these numbers too big, and you have an option. If you want a change to take place right away, you can always change the name of that file, but you need to make sure that you adjust all the places where that name is important, because then you could break your site by making a change. So most of this stuff is like that, right? You got to be balancing one thing against another. Server page caching, the typical kinds of caches you think of, WordPress cache plugins, examples like Super Cache and W3 Total Cache, Fastest Cache, etc. Those are the ones everybody thinks of when they're talking about a cache. What that functionality is that when a user goes to a web page, let me go to this next diagram. Whoops. This diagram here. The user comes in, user on the left, right? Comes in, goes to WordPress, goes out to PHP, starts generating a page. Now I need to get all the data out of the database, do some more PHP, get some more database, put it all together, Now I have my HTML content, I send it to the user. They come back tomorrow and they go to, they get to WordPress and it says, oh, I've got this page in the cache, and it just sends it right to you. And it doesn't go to PHP, and it doesn't go to the database, and it doesn't have to do all that building, and it can save a lot of time. There's also host-specific caching here. For example, if you're on SiteGround, SiteGround has something called the SG Optimizer. It's a pretty good cache because it's designed to be used in that one place. It takes advantage of more than just this, but it only works with their hosting. There's another one, Lightspeed Web Server. It's a very good cache as well, but it only works if you have a Lightspeed server. It doesn't work on Apache, it doesn't work on Nginx, so you don't want that unless you have Lightspeed. Another feature that you want is this auto flush capability. That is, when you turn on your cache, as users come to all the different pages of your website, those pages are moved into the cache. When it generates the page for that user, it takes that generated page and puts it in the cache, right? And then the next guy that comes for that page, he gets what's in the cache. And then you change your post, right? You change a couple of words, you put in some paragraphs, you change a photo, whatever it is that you do to change that post or page, the cache is now different from what you would get if you weren't using a cache. You can go in and manually, flush the cache, but that would flush maybe the whole cache, or they might have a capability to flush this one page. But you'd like that to be automatic, so you don't have to worry about that. So as you make changes, that one page is refreshed the next time somebody goes there, and you don't have to do that manually. That's an important feature to pay attention to. There are lots of other features on these caching programs as well. Another thing that most people don't know about caching applications is they are not for logged in users. They are only for users who are not logged in. Right? You would think the logged in users would get the best performance, but that's not the case. The logged in users really need the most current data, and you need to depend on that. So they need, they don't do it that way. It's strictly for non-logged in users. But it does work in conjunction with the browser cache. These things are additive. They're not, they don't take each other's place. It's not like you implement one or the other. You want to do both of these. Front-end performance, we talked about the client browser caching. Image optimization, we'll get into some details. You want to minimize JavaScript and CSS, meaning make them smaller, not have fewer, right? Not have less of it, but there's a technique to make the files themselves actually smaller by squeezing space out. You want to concatenate JavaScript and CSS, but that's only true unless you're using HTTP2, in which case it's no longer necessary. Avoid render blocking, meaning if you put the JavaScript and the CSS in the head, which is the default of all of this, then the JavaScript blocks the CSS and the page won't render until all the JavaScript is loaded and finished. Even if there's no JavaScript needed on that page, even if the JavaScript doesn't do anything until somebody clicks on something in the page, it still makes the page go slower. So you want that JavaScript to come after the CSS. Right? And that's what that piece is all about. Also, we talked about using a CDN, a content delivery network. On image optimization, this is a very big one, but it's not just compression. Image optimization, you want to make sure you're using the right kind of image file for each image you have. So if you have photographs, you want them to be JPEGs, right? If you have something that requires transparency, you want it to be a PNG. If you have vector images, you use SVG, although SVG files are not supported directly, natively by WordPress, so you have to have a plugin in order to use those files directly. You want to crop your photos for maximum impact. You have a photo of the cute puppy, and you have lots of background of half the yard and your house, right? But the puppy's the only important thing in the photo. Crop all that junk out, focus on the puppy, right? I mean, you don't have to crop everything down to the minimum. You want a little background to make the photo look good. But the more wasted background, the more wasted transmission time and size of your file. Right sizing images is very important. You take a photo from your camera, for example, or you get a high-res photo from the web, and they're often thousands of pixels by thousands of pixels. And you don't display them at that size on your web, you display them in a much smaller size. WordPress is perfectly capable of resizing those files on the fly, so they'll always be the size on your page that you tell it to be. But you don't want to download a 5 meg file when a 50K file will do, right? So right size the file before you put it on the web. And then you're going to wind up creating typically you'll create multiple versions of the same file in different sizes. So you might use a file as a featured image, and it might be, I don't know, 1200 by 900 or something like that. You might use it as a thumbnail, it might be 150 by 150. You know, in those two cases, those are the only two different sizes you have. Then you have the image, you keep both sizes on there, and then your plugin is going to send the appropriate one and go that way, right? You want to also, you want to keep those number of different sizes to a minimum. So if you have 6 different sizes on your pages, right, depending on the function, right, are they in a carousel? Are they in a thumbnail? Is it a featured image? Whatever. Then you use a lot of disk space because you have 6 different copies of the file. So try to the extent you can, based on the design needs you have, to have the fewest number of different sizes. Also, you don't want to serve video directly off your server. Put the video on a video serving application like YouTube, like Vimeo. There's a bunch of others. I'm not saying you need to use those two, but get it off your website and then embed it in your website so that the people they click on it, still get the video, but you're not using your bandwidth. You're not running up your big bill at for your host for this, right? Also, there's something called lazy loading, which is pretty valuable, meaning that when you open up a page, you only see usually you only see a portion of it, right? The page is bigger than the view window, but the page, it continues to load. It loads all the stuff in the view window, and it's loading all the stuff on the rest of the page too. Well, what a lazy loader is typically it's a plugin that will watch and not download all the images that don't appear in the viewport. And then as the person scrolls and gets to someplace close to where that image is going to be visible, then it gets the image. So that by the time they scroll up there, the image is there, but it didn't get it up front. So it saves that effort, right? So you get better page load speed initially, and the user doesn't know the difference. Image compression here is a big one. Images consume a lot of bandwidth, the most on most people's sites. The size reductions can be enormous. They're not necessarily enormous. It depends on what your original files were, where you got them from, how closely they were to being compressed in the first place. Compression types, there's 2. Lossless. You don't get a lot of benefit from lossless compression, but the photo quality remains absolutely maximized, right? There's no change in the quality. So like if you sell photographs for a living, then you don't want to use anything but lossless compression, because you don't want to, make the photo even in a tiny way, any less or lower quality than your actual product. But in most web uses, that's not the case. You typically want to trade off performance against, a lot of performance gain against a very small visual loss. Lossy is what that's called. So you want typically to get a lot of compression, but you want the quality to be controllable, because depending on the kind of photo, you may find, well, this photo is great at 40%, I can't see the difference, but this one over here, no, I can start to see it degrade if I go below 60. Image manipulation software, if you want to do this manually, if you're creating 1 page a week and you're just getting started, you can use a product like GIMP or Photoshop. You bring the photo in, you change the size to be the size of the maximum one on your website, you compress it, you bring it down, then you put it up in the media library, you're done. If you want it to be automatic, you get one of these type products. I just have them in alphabetical order. I'm not pushing one over the other, and there's lots more. But the idea is, you might have 100 pages or 500 posts out there. You might have photos in all of them, and you don't want to have to go back manually and do all that work. But you get one of these programs, you can tell it, look, go out in bulk and just compress all my images, right? And by the way, create all my thumbnails for me too while you're at it, right? Some of these things are just fabulous in terms of how much work they'll do. When you're evaluating which of the many compression products to get, there are a lot of different features to consider. Does it do all the formats? Will it resize? Will it create the thumbnails? Does it do bulk? All of that stuff. So pay attention to that. It's not just whether this one will get 90% compression and this one only gets 89%, right? Performance is good, but these other things matter. This is not typical performance or typical improvement, but it's a realistic improvement for certain kinds of things. What I did, I just took my ordinary middle-of-the-road Android phone, and I took a picture. And then the dimensions of that photo originally are 31 by 4100. It's a 3.2 megabyte photo or file. The next thing I did was I compressed that file using 40%. So I took 60%, it's only 40% quality, supposedly, although I couldn't see the difference. Maybe if I blew it up in a huge way, I could see the difference. But, in any size that would be reasonable on a web page, I couldn't see the difference at 40%. Excuse me. And I got an 88% reduction in size just by doing that one thing, right? Now I'm talking about, 366K for the file. The next line is different. I took the file and I converted it, I scaled it from 3120 by 4160 down to 900 by 1200. I did no compression whatsoever, and it came down to 750K. Excuse me. So that's not as much benefit as the compression, but this file has no compression in it whatsoever. Right? Then I started combining both of them. I took that smaller version, the 900 by 1200, and I compressed it at 80%, 60%, 40%, and I got all the way down to 55K from 3.2 megabytes, right? So the differences that are possible, this is not what you're going to get every time you compress a file, by any means. It depends on what your source was and all of that. If you get stuff off the web, sometimes they'll already be compressed, right? So, but I'm saying this is, if you take an image off your phone, this is what's possible. And this is the mistake you can make if you don't do it. You don't want to wind up putting that 3.2 meg image on your server. Modern technologies, HTTPS is a new version of HTTP, the protocol that manages all the transport of your web information to the client. And basically, what it does is it creates a set of parallel capabilities so that more of your website can come down at the same time. And so it obviates the need to put all your CSS files in one CSS file and all your JavaScript files in one, because it doesn't care about this. It used to be the case that your browser, it would go out and get pieces of your website, and the most it could do at any one time was 2, or depending on which version of the browser you had, maybe 4 different files could be coming down, different pieces of your website could be coming down at the same time. Those limits aren't here anymore if you switch to the newer version. Right? I'm sorry, I've been talking about HTTP2, and HTTPS is the one on the screen. This is the security part, right? This is the encryption. HTTPS encrypts your website. This is what you need to get the little green lock. This is what you need in order to do selling anything on the web. And this is a requirement in order to do the HTTP2 stuff, which is where the performance comes from. Google is saying you need HTTPS now. They are putting notices on pages that you go to on the web that are not HTTPS, and people don't want their users to see those notices, and that's why they do that. They're trying to push everybody to go to HTTPS. Not only do they want more security, but that security is necessary in order to go to the next step, which they also want to push, which is a performance issue, and that's the HTTP2. That's controlled by your host, so you want to check, does your host support HTTP2? If they do, and your users have any of these browsers here at the bottom, right? Any of these versions, the Google browser version 40 and up, they're on 65 or 66 now. So they've supported it for a very long time. That's the case for all of those, right? So they've supported this technology for a long time, but not a lot of people have used it. There's a site, the test site in the handout, so that you can find out whether they do. You don't have to go to them necessarily, but you have to implement it and then see if it turned on, or you can go to another site that's on that same host. The multiplexed streams are the piece I was talking about earlier. That's the name of it. The need for domain sharding. It used to be that there was a workaround because that 4 simultaneous download limit. One way around that was to take all your static resources and move them to another domain. So you create a subdomain and you put all that static stuff, your photos, your CSS, whatever, you put that in that other domain. And then when you create your page, you give some things a link to the current page, and some things a link to the other domain, and now it can do 4 simultaneous from each of your multiple domains. And depending on how many resources you had per page, you may want to have 2 or 3 or 4 of those. But it's a lot of pain to manage all that crap, but you don't need any more of that because the new technology takes care of it. Another modern technology that you definitely want to implement is you want to move to PHP 7, right? It is much faster. And it's transparent essentially to you as long as the products that you use, the plugins, will support PHP 7, and the vast majority do. It's nearly twice as fast. It has much better latency. WordPress, since version 4, has been optimized for PHP 7. That's how they care. They want you to move to PHP 7. And there's a product out there, a plugin in the repository called the PHP Compatibility Checker. You can run that again and tell it, look at all my plugins, either look at all my active plugins or even look at all my inactive plugins and tell me if any of them are incompatible, right? The vast majority are compatible. Again, it's got a couple of graphs here to give you an idea. The blue is an idea how much performance, in requests per second. As you see, PHP 5.3, 4, 5 moving to right, and then PHP 7, the performance gets ever so slightly better in the different versions of PHP 5, and then you get to 7, and the performance nearly doubles, right? There's the one on the end there, HHVM, that's a Facebook variant of PHP as well, but it's kind of like the Betamax and VHS from a long time ago. They fought early on. The PHP 7.1 HHVM is just basically gone now. So you don't really need to worry about that. Another version, this is just the latency, and it's latency compared. The orange is 10 simultaneous clients. The purple, the bluish purple is, or the lilac, I guess, is the 20 simultaneous clients, and the red is 40 simultaneous clients. And as you can see, all of them are substantially better with the newer version. And then this is showing the older version of WordPress against the newer version. Obviously, the slide is old, 4.1 isn't new anymore, but the idea being that even with PHP 7, over here, this is quite a bit faster than the 5.6, even in version 3.6, but 4.1, you can see this version of PHP 7 is way faster than this one. So, and you get that benefit from just having a new version of WordPress. Turning off what you don't like, I said there's lots and lots of stuff out there. The 2 big programs to do this are Clearfy and WP Disable. They will give you, 50, 70 different things that you can turn off. And you can read through each one of them. It's, no one of them makes a big difference, but if you do quite a bit of them, it is useful. And again, most of them are things that you'll, never use or couldn't care less about. Other things that you don't use, that you don't want to have there, you want to deactivate or delete unused plugins, right? You want to push plugins that that only work or only needed on certain pages. You want them to only load on those pages. Typically, the way WordPress functions, you activate a plugin. That plugin is activated on every single page you have. I don't mean just pages, posts, all that. It's there all the time. It's sucking up resources and doing nothing, right? So you get a plugin just to do the accordion on your fact page, and then you have 150 other pages on your website, and in every one of them, that plugin is loaded, right? You don't want that. And one way to get rid of that are these 3 plugins here: Plugin Organizer, Plugin Load Filter, and a paid plugin called Perf Matters. And you can say, only load this plugin on this page, or only load it on this select group of pages, right? JavaScript, PHP, CSS, the same idea. You can use a product called Code Snippets Extended. You can have code snippets of each one of those different kind of things and say, only load this on this page, or only load it on this group of pages. Right? If you don't have to load it, you don't want to waste the time sending it down. Plugins themselves, a myth, I guess. Deactivated plugins do not slow down your WordPress. They are not a problem from a performance perspective, even if you have 100 of them. They don't load, so they don't matter from a performance perspective. That doesn't mean that there's a free ride, right? If you have a bunch of deactivated plugins, they can still be security problems. So you need to keep them updated. Right? They still use disk space. Some plugins are fairly large. Virtually every host has a disk space limit. The more junk you have that you don't use, the more you waste valuable resources from your server. Also, they can add to your backup times depending on how you configure your backup. Some people want to configure the backup so that I hit one button to do a restore and I bring back everything. If that's the case, you're also backing up, your themes, and you're backing up your plugins, you're backing up your database all at once. And the more stuff you have to back up, the longer it takes, the bigger it is. You want to keep inactive plugins to the extent that you can on a staging or a dev site, just like before. If you care about their inactive, if you're not deleting them, it's probably because you're not sure if you want to get rid of it and you don't want to have to go download it again, or you only use it once a week to check on something and then you turn it back off, whatever. Do that on your dev site. You don't need to do it on production. Active plugins that aren't runtime related, again, can be on the staging or dev site. Suppose you have a plugin to check for broken links. Maybe you run it once a week. You check it on your dev site and you find, okay, here's 2 broken links, and then you will fix it in production. You don't run it on production. That slows it down, and every user has a problem with that. Multi-purpose plugins. Some of these plugins, whether it's a caching plugin or some of these other plugins, they cover a wide range of functionality. And having one plugin that does 7 things you need may be better than having 7 individual plugins. It depends on what you need. They may have 10 features, maybe you only want 3 of them. So maybe it's not the right thing to do, but you want to be thinking about it and knowing that those kind of things are available and make your own decision. Plugins also, they often add CSS, which adds to requests. You got tools to find slow plugins, which plugins, but you might have 100 plugins, and the reason it's so widely believed that plugins, how many plugins you have matter, is because some plugins are very slow. And you might have one of those plugins that makes your site slow, and because plugins load on every page, if you have a slow plugin, it just ruins your whole site. So you want to find it. And there are multiple applications here. The one that's most popular, the one that everybody knows about, is the Plugin Performance Profile, or P3. The problem is that this is well over 2 years old. It hasn't been updated in a very long time, and it doesn't work with PHP 7, right? And they're not going to fix it. So there are other options here, the debug objects query monitor. You can use the waterfall tab in the performance tests that we talked about earlier, and you can use the network tab in your browser tools. They're more tedious to do it that way because you have to look at every single request. You might have a page that has 25 requests. You might have a page that has 150, and you have to look at every one of them and find which one of them have the name of the plugin in it, and then add those up because it might hit it 4 or 5 times, and then see, okay, what's the overall hit to my server from that plugin, right? But most of them are pretty simple. The query monitor will do that. Queries are usually the pieces of the plugins that suck up the most resources and time. Not always, but mostly. So you might start with that one because a really slow one will almost always have slow queries in it, and you can quickly zoom in on the ones that are a problem. Sometimes plugins, for example, a gallery plugin, right? There might be 50 galleries to choose from, and you chose the one that had just the features that you wanted, and speed wasn't a feature that you even thought about, right? But you might find that one gallery plugin is 3 times faster than another gallery plugin. You didn't know that. You got the slow one, right? So you go find out, uh-oh, my gallery plugin's really slow. And that doesn't mean you're done with galleries. It just means you need to look back to the list and figure out, okay, well, what was my second choice on the galleries? Maybe I want to switch. And I have a section of notorious plugins that are listed in the handout as well, that are particularly slow. Minification and concatenation. Minification is when you programmatically remove all the wasted space in a file. So in a CSS file or in a JavaScript file, the server and the workstation, they don't pay any attention to white space, right? And so all that white space is removed, right? And lines are jammed all together, right? And it takes out all the comments. And so a file might squeeze down maybe half, right? Depending on how much of that stuff you have. But it's still exactly the same file. It runs in the workstation after it's been minified without change. It doesn't have to do anything to it in the workstation. It just runs it because the white space didn't mean anything to it in the first place. That's different from compression. When you compress a file, you can't use it until it's decompressed. So the workstation has to spend a little bit of resources to decompress it first. But they're different technologies and they are additive, so you want to do both, right? Concatenation is when you create one file of a file type and squeeze a bunch of previously individual files and put them all in that one file. So maybe you have 15 different JavaScript files, and you can take all those JavaScript files and programmatically put them in one file, right? They still, all the different pieces of it have names, the functions are it still works exactly the same way. And it really isn't any smaller because it's one file, but all the stuff is in there. But it's only one request instead of 15 requests. So it's every time you have to go back and forth to the server, you got that delay, right? You got the, how long does it take before the server responds, and then it sends it, you got to wait for it. And that's all sequential, right? And all that's eliminated. You get to HTTP2, then you don't need to worry about this. But if you don't have that, then you definitely want to do the concatenation in these applications. A lot of programs will do this for you, especially programs that, they'll talk about what's the word I used earlier? Anyway, there's lots of plugins that will do this for you, but this is an area where things can slightly go wrong, right? And so you want to be careful with this. You want to do a little extra testing if you implement this. A CDN we talked about earlier. This is where your static files are placed on different servers all over the world. So you might have a CDN that has 150 servers across the world, and you pay them. Typically, the CDNs aren't free. There are some that are free, but the vast majority of them are paid. And you pay them. They take your static files and they distribute them, put copies on every one of those servers. And then when somebody goes to download your page, all the resources that are on any one of those servers are pulled from the closest geographically server to that person, right? So if you have a lot of international users, for example, this is very valuable. It's not as valuable in the United States because typically these people have one or two, server sites in the United States, and then they'll have, 6 in Europe, and they'll have 2 or 3 in Asia, and they'll have 1 in Australia, and they'll have a couple in Africa, and they'll have some in South America. And depending on where your users are, it can make a huge amount of difference. If all your users are in the United States, the benefit is smaller, but it's noticeable. Might not be worth $20 a month, or $9 a month, or depending. But that's for you to decide. But you should at least know about it and make an intelligent decision as opposed to not knowing at all. Again, there's a free one. The used to be called Photon. It's part of Jetpack. Now they've changed the name. It's now the WP Image CDN. If you have Jetpack, you turn it on, and it works. Right? I mean, that's great. But they keep a copy of your file forever. They don't give it back. You can't tell them to get rid of it. They keep it. Right? So that's you might care, you might not care. There are free tiers of normally paid services like Amazon and Cloudflare, but the free tiers don't allow you, they're basically for users that don't have much traffic. Right? As soon as you get much traffic, then you're going to be disqualified out of the free tier, and they expect you to upgrade. But the free tier gives you enough of an opportunity to assess what the performance is like. Did I get enough value out of this to pay $10 a month or $50 a month or whatever? Typically, when they first came out with CDNs, they were for big clients, right? But they've gotten cheaper, they've gotten easier to use, and so a lot of people use them now. And then, of course, there's a couple of fairly popular ones that are paid. Database optimization is another thing that you'll see if you read an article about performance for WordPress. They will almost always tell you about this and make a big deal about it, but it's not. I'm telling you, it's not a big deal, right? WordPress is designed to run with millions of records and still be performant if you use it correctly. And what this is, if, for example, you don't adjust the revisions, every time you make a change to a post or page, another copy of that content is saved in the database. So if you have 300 posts and you've made 30 changes to every post over the lifetime of while you were editing it and creating it and then going back and fixing a word because you misspelled it and whatever. Every one of those is a new page. Now you got 900 copies, right? 900 records in your database. But 900 records is nothing. WordPress, the performance on 900 records versus 30, 390,000 I'm talking about, as opposed to 300. The difference is a nit, right? But it might bother you. It does consume a little bit more disk space. Maybe your host would care. Maybe if you're close to the limit, that matters. If you care, you can clean it up. There's a, you can do a one-time cleanup with WP Sweep or WP Optimize. You can get rid of all these extra revisions. You can get rid of comments that have been deleted. You can get rid of comments that are spam, that are still sitting out there, and all that kind of stuff. There's other cleanup methods, pieces as well. Something you probably want to do, if you care about this, is this piece here, revision management. In the WP config file, there's typically a line for define the WP post revisions. It doesn't have to be in there. I'm not sure by default whether it's in there at all. It might not be. If it's not, the default is keep all the revisions. Right? But you can change it or put it in and give it a different number. If you put 0, you keep no revisions, only the current one. And if it's greater than 0, whatever that number is, that's how many you keep. So if you make it 3, for example, it'll keep the last 3 revisions. So if you make a change and then you realize, no, I really want to go back to where it was, and you forget exactly what to change it. It's easier to go back than it is to redo it. Then you can go back. But you can only go back 3 because you only have 3, right? But how many times have you gone back and looked at 50 to pick the one you liked, right? Probably never. So, keep that number small. It keeps the database small, but from a performance perspective, it's a nit. It's not really that much of an issue. There are also trade-offs you can make for improved performance that affect functionality. You may want to do these things, you may not want to do them. It depends on how much you care about the trade-off, right? For example, you can have fewer images per post because images are slower, and maybe you don't need so many. Maybe, and that will speed up your web page, but it also may make your web page less interesting to the user. You might not want to do that. You can make the images smaller. Maybe you have a huge, big banner for your featured image, and your thumbnails are large, and maybe you could make them smaller, and that would make them faster. But it might not be as attractive. I don't know. You make the decision. But it's something to consider. You want to weigh which way you want to go. Same thing's true with using fonts. Everybody thinks it's wonderful. Oh man, I can use all these Google fonts. It's great. I can have any font I want. But you got to download those fonts every time, right? I mean, they'll wind up in your cache. But typically the caches expire and you'll wind up getting them over and over again. If you do wind up with custom fonts though, you want to use fewer of them and you want to use fewer styles. You don't want to load the one, the bold and the bold italic and the level 300 and the 300 weight, the 500 weight, the 700 weight, the 900 weight, because you don't use most of those. And you probably shouldn't use most of those. You want to keep it to a smaller number. From a performance perspective, also, if you pick the popular fonts out of Google, then it's a much greater chance that the user is already going to have that font in his cache from having visited somebody else's website, because lots of people use Google fonts. But they only use the popular ones. If you use a font that's not very popular, it's not going to be in anybody's cache. But if you use one that's in the top 3 or 4, then you'd be surprised at how often it can be hit. Avatars. If you get a lot of comments, avatars are pain because it just keeps having to go out and get another one and get another one and get another one. And that's a slow process, right? And that's slowing down your page. So you can solve that either by getting rid of the avatars, or you can switch and have a generic avatar for everybody, although that's really hardly different from not having them. And the other thing would be implement an avatar caching plugin, so that the first time that avatar has gone out and gotten, it puts a copy on your server, and then it uses the copy on the server. They also have typically a capability to say, well, how often do you go check to see if that's current, right? Because people change their avatars over time. But anyway, that's another thing. Also, social networks. Do you really need all 27 social networks on your page, right? Maybe people are really only using Facebook and one other, right? So pick the ones that people use and only put those on there, and save yourself from having all this extra images and all the extra PHP behind them, on every place that you use them. Only put them in places where people are likely to click. Put them on a post. You don't need to put them on your about page and your, and all these other pages, right? But again, these are decisions you make as far as you're losing functionality for performance. Maybe you care about the functionality more than you care about the performance. That's up to you. I'm not telling you how to do it, just pay attention to that. Gutenberg is slow. It's going to be wonderful, they say. And from what I've seen from some of the demonstrations, it is going to be really great. But right now, it's really slow. Pages take 5 times longer to load than they do without it. That doesn't mean they won't fix it by the time it's in production, by the time it's put into, right now it's in beta, right? So beta's never as good. They may make, maybe it'll be faster. I don't know, but it's something to pay attention to. And there's links to an article that explains that in a handout. And I'm done. Any questions? No questions. Wow. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
What do you know about AWP if I wanted to throw a bunch of images up there?
I'm sorry, AWP? Amazon
Yeah,
Web? Whatever. Okay. I mean, you can use like Amazon S3, I think they call it, for storing, static files and things. I mean, you can use that. It's not the easiest product to use. It's more designed for developers than it is for average or newbie web designers. But it certainly works. It's fast. It's it's
easier to learn.
What's that?
Cloudflare CD.
Yeah, right. Cloudflare's quite a bit easier to use.
Super easy. It's like you just push a button.
Yeah.
And it works.
And Cloudflare, and I think one of the other ones, there's a link to a tutorial in there about how to use it. They typically have a whole bunch of options, and which options do you want? They'll go over that in the tutorial. Some of these things on the caching, some of them are like W3 Total Cache is extremely complicated. I mean, it has this huge number of options, and a lot of people stay away from it because they just don't have any idea of how to set the options. And they make it different. That's the reason they put them in there, is because depending on your site, you may want to configure it one way, different site needs it configured a different way to maximize, but you have to know a lot, right? Or you have to do one heck of a lot of experimentation. And some of these other ones, they'll pick, give you fewer options, but these are the ones that give you good performance, maybe not absolutely the best possible performance. One thing though, you'll find if you take a look at these different websites that I've highlighted for reviews of the caching, for example, is that the same cache doesn't wind up in the number 1 or 2 position on any of the different articles, right? So article A will have cache A at the top and say this is spectacular, and article B will say no, that's crap. You want cache B, right? So you pays your money, it takes your choice. But they do provide a lot of information. You might want to take with a grain of salt some of the numbers that they put on there, because for that site that's probably accurate. I'm not saying that they've done anything wrong, but again, your mileage may vary. But the data that they provide about how to configure, and this is important for this piece, and this is important for that piece, and this you can pay no attention to, and whatever. That stuff's important, and there's a lot of good information in all of those. Yes?
Do you have any issues when you use a Google page speed and issues with caching? So you're making a change and then you're using page speed that it's not seeming to make a difference. Is that because it's cached still? Should we be turning caching off to make these changes?
I'm trying to remember now. I think when they run, they don't use a cache, right? So every time you click on it, it's without a cache,
Okay.
for that very reason,
That's
right? So an actual user, the second time they come to your site, if that second time is reasonably close to the first time, should see better performance than the numbers that you see in those charts. But those numbers are uncached performance.
Isn't there one factor that Google page speed insights take into consideration, that if you don't have a cache, then it's going to tell you if you have?
Oh, it'll tell you whether you have one, or implemented,
Yeah.
and if you don't have the cache headers, the expires headers set, it'll tell you about that, right? Yeah, I mean, When I say pay attention not to the magic number but the actual speed number, that doesn't mean that all the detail in those various products is unimportant. The detail tells you what things that you should look at, right? And how much of a difference maybe it makes. If you have one item there and you get a D on it or an F on it, you know, that might be something you want to pay attention to. But it might turn out that you go from a D to an A and, you know, you can't see any performance improvement because it just wasn't something that really mattered all that much.
And what about above the fold issues?
Above the fold just means the fold is considered what's on the main page, right? It comes from newspapers, the actual fold in a newspaper. You get the top, it's like, you know, the stuff above the fold is what everybody looks at. And after that, it's what some people look at, right? And the same thing on your page. When your page downloads into a workstation or a phone, the stuff you can see before you scroll, that's called above the fold, right? And that's the part that's the most important from a performance perspective. The stuff that's below that is not so important unless it's blocking the stuff at the top. And that's that render blocking issue. The render blocking is a big deal. But if you've eliminated the render blocking, then the other stuff is just gratis, right?
Do you have anything in your notes about how to take care of render blocking?
I believe there's something in there about that. Products like Auto Optimize or Above the Fold that are free plugins in the repository. There's a whole bunch of others. I'm not saying those are the two that you have to use, but they are probably the most well-known, most downloaded versions. And then, especially the Above the Fold, the one that's actually called Above the Fold, is a very complex product, and it's not for beginners, right? You're more likely to break something than you are to fix something with that product. Auto Optimize is a lot simpler. There's a lot of combinations of things. You know, one product will only do minimization, another one will only do concatenation, one will do both, and has it cache, and it has this, and it has, you know, and there's this whole spread of products that do different things, right? And so you want to be paying attention to that as well as just how well they work. Some are easy to use, some are not quite so easy to use, but you know, you can pick some products. You know, you can optimize, you know, render blocking, and go out on the web and get, if the resources I've given you here are inadequate, you can go find some more resources and read what people will tell you, and they will provide typically some options for plugins to do that. You know, but they may have tried 2 or 3. They found one they liked the best. They tell you about it. They may not have tried the one that's the absolute best, right? There's probably 100 applications out there that do one or more pieces of this. Again, it's not. There's a lot you can do, and you will see, if you haven't done any of it yet, you can see very large benefits if you do a bunch of these. But it isn't necessarily, you know, sit down for an hour and do it and you're done, right? Yes.
So for render blocking and minifying, are plugins the easiest way to do that kind of stuff if you're not a developer then?
Yes.
Okay.
One option, I don't know if I may get to it here. It's way back at the beginning. On this, in the Google one for sure, and I think in the GTmetrix one as well, when you open up any one of these items and get to the detail, sometimes, like, they'll have this one here, and it'll give you, like for example, on the optimize images. Take optimize images, and you open it up, and here's a list of 300 images or whatever images that it thinks you could optimize to give you a benefit. And it'll say, you know, with this image you could save 50 bytes. With this image you could save 500K. With this image you could save whatever. And then, especially in the Google one, I think in some of these others, they'll then give you a link and say, would you like the optimized image? Here it is. And you just click on it and download it. But that's one at a time, right? If you have lots of pages with lots of images, that's a lot of work. But they do offer it. And so if you only have one, hey, you know, why go through the trouble of doing it some other way? Just grab it and stick it on there. Yes, Jim. We'll come back.
If you're using like Sass or one of those other languages for like your CSS and your jQuery, like some of those front-end optimized processes will actually do your minification and everything else as part of that.
Yeah, you can have them as plugins in your development stream.
So I think that just depends. Like if you go like to the front-end developer group, they will talk about all of that, like how they minify their JavaScript and how they minify their CSS. It's all like a little process thing that they do browser and print mode, everything else. Then there's also like a couple of libraries that you can load on your server that do that specifically for your CSS and your JavaScript as well.
Yeah. The plugin route is probably the easiest.
That's more
It's,
my level right now.
What typically what they do is when you turn them on, they will grab the different CSS files that they can find, and they will put them all in one, and they will typically minify it as well, and then they'll store it and use it, and they don't redo that until you either add a new CSS file or change one of them, and then they'll redo that process, right? You don't have to manually do that. The plugin, it takes care of all that, right? Sometimes they'll only minify. Sometimes they'll do both. It depends on the plugin you get.
Right.
But this process is this knowledge about how to do these things has been out there now for quite a while. And the plugins that used to compete with each other, I do this, I do that, I do this other thing, and now they all, not all, but most of them do many of these things. Right? So you don't need as many plugins to get all this stuff done. Again, if you put HTTP2 on your website, first you get the HTTPS to get the security, and then that enables you to turn on HTTP2, two T's. Then the concatenation is no longer a benefit. It doesn't hurt, but it's complexity without a benefit. Shrinking the files, minifying them, is beneficial no matter what, because it means the files are smaller. No more question? Another question. Okay, no problem.
Upgrading PHP 7.
Yes.
Is that something that's automatically done on my theme, or is that something I need to do?
No, it's something you need to do. You may have to contact your host to find out how,
Okay.
but most hosts make it easy. If you go into, typically the host uses cPanel. Some hosts have something different, but it's analogous, all right? And somewhere in that cPanel is going to be a way to manage your PHP version. Typically, you can just go in and say, load 7.0 or 7.1 or 5.6. You can go forward or backwards. It's not a problem, but typically that's how to do it. If you can't find that in your cPanel or the version that they have on, some other hosts, they don't use cPanel, they have their own version. But if you can't find that, then just put in a ticket or give a call to your host and they'll tell you how to do it. It may be the case that a host doesn't support PHP 7, but that would be rare nowadays.
Or they may want you to move to another server. Like WP Engine, when they first deployed, they made everybody move from whatever servers they were on at PHP 7 to other servers that were PHP 7.
One reason why so many hosts support PHP 7 is because it's a benefit to you and it's also a benefit to them. Because with PHP 7, they can put twice as many websites on a host. While you're improving your performance with PHP 7, they're taking it away by putting more stuff on the server. So it's a balancing act. Nothing is free, right? But so know that happens. But that's why it's so widely supported, and the benefits are obvious and right away, right? I mean, you really can see it. It's not a 5% thing. It's big. Yes.
I had one situation with a client once that I made a change, and then he didn't see the change because of the caching. And
Right.
then neither one of us figured it out at first. He was telling me I'm not listening. What's the best way to manage that kind of situation that I make sure that they see, even though
It depends on the kind of change that you make, right? Some changes you manage by flushing the cache in the server, right? And other changes you would need to have the cache flushed in the workstation, right? Either flushing it or have it expire. But you cannot control that. You might be able to tell your client, for him to see it, he needs to flush his cache. But you can't call up all his clients and tell them to flush their caches. That's not going to happen, right? So that's where you need to adjust by, if you have something that's important and you want to see it implemented right away, maybe some big CSS change because you've revamped your site and now you put a whole bunch of new colors in or change the design or whatever. You want that new CSS to be seen by everybody right away. You might need to change the name of the CSS file. Maybe instead of having styles.css CSS, you have styles 2/1 18, right? And then every time you change it, you just change the date. and that changes the name of the file. You know, that kind of thing. That would implement it easier because now when they go to get the CSS file, they need the new one, right? They need the one with a new name. And so they don't have that in the cache. They can't because you just put it out there. So they have to go get that one. But then that one is going to stay in the cache for 30 days, 90 days, depending on how you set it. Yes?
They can spell that CSS the same name, but actually have it include the name of your version CSS instead.
There you go.
And that way, like, because style.css is what WordPress and your theme and everything is looking for. Again, it's kind of like the standard. But if you include the name of your other style sheet that has a version number in it, then that forces that version number fixed. That's the only value you actually have to change.
Well, what happens when I empty the cache? Like,
You need to be the cache at the
Remember, which cache are you emptying? Are you emptying the cache on the server or are you emptying the cache on the workstation? Right? They're different.
okay.
So when a user clears his cache, right, then he's going to get everything from the server, right? Because there's nothing in his cache, so he can't use the cached copy of any resource. Every single picture, every single set of text, every page, he's going to get it all from the server. And once he gets it, then the next time he goes, he's going to get the newly downloaded stuff, right? The cache on the server, you can turn that off, or flush it, or flush parts of it. Typically, the modern caches are all, you can flush a page at a time, or the whole thing, right? And you flush it once, and now that cache has been changed for every client. But that still doesn't control the individual cache in their workstation. They're different, right? They do different things, and they work independently. So you just have to remember which one you want to flush, right? And you control the one in the server. The user controls the one in their workstation. You don't control that.
Right.
I suppose there's some technology that could let you control it, but I don't know of any.
So could you use the expires cover?
I'm sorry, what?
Could you use the expires cover to force?
Well, yeah, the expires header, if you set it for, an hour, then it's going to expire in an hour, right? But you're not going to get much of a benefit from the workstation cache in that case, right? Every time they go there, the first time they go, they're always going to download everything, right? But if they go from page A to page B and then back to page A within an hour, then they'll get it. But it doesn't reset. It's not an hour from the last time they loaded the page. It's an hour from the first time they brought it down to the workstation. So it's only going to be an hour, right? So you might want, you adjust accordingly, right? Yes?
You mentioned there's a punishment soon for Google
Performance?
for not having HTTPS.
Correct. It's not a punishment so much as it is a message, a warning message to the end user, which is, actually a pretty big punishment. Your users do not want to see your website saying this website's not secure, right? Right? You don't want that. Even though maybe there's nothing on there that matters, they still want to push you to get HTTPS. If you're not selling anything, then the fact that your website's not encrypted is not really a very big deal, right? If somebody's going to steal your text, well, they can steal your text whether it's encrypted or not. So there's not really a lot of security benefit unless you're doing, money or passwords, and the passwords are already encrypted. So, it's not as critical, but they want to push that mainly because, they want more people to sell stuff on the web and do things properly, but they also want to move HTTP2 to be a big, much more widely used, and you can't unless you move HTTPS. Technically, the encryption of HTTPS is not required for HTTP2, but every single browser that's out there requires it. So it's moot that technically it could work without it. It won't work without it. And so they want to push B, so they have to push A, and that's the way to do it. They push B also by telling you, we're going to rate your website higher. We're going to give you a higher rank in the page rank or whatever they call it now, right? From searches, if your website is faster. But that's not the only way to make your website faster. All of those other things behind the scenes that make your website faster, all of those things matter. And they want your website to be faster. Look, if you think back when you first got on the web and remember what pages looked like, they were much less interesting than they are today. I mean, people have videos now, and you have great images and high resolution, and you have all this really cool stuff, and you have JavaScript, and you have all that. And the web's getting bigger, and the size of the pages has gone from, you know, an average of 60K to an average of 2.5 megs. And it's only going to go up. But, you know, you need to implement these performance. The web's gotten a little faster, but it hasn't gotten anywhere near that much faster, right? So you need to make the page itself faster.
And Google's all about customer experience.
Well, the more web pages you see, the more ads you see, the more money Google makes. Google's about making money like any other company, right? It's about the money. And, you know, that's a way to make money. They sell advertising. They sell you. They sell information about you. And that's where they make the money. The more they have about you, the more pages you go to, the better off they are. And nothing evil about it. It's just the way they work. Any other questions? Yes?
One of the things that I've learned is one of the things that slows down your sites the most is all pictures. Everybody wants to fill with pictures, and usually, you know, either the ones we find or the customer provides for us are 1920 by 1080, sometimes are 4K.
Yeah.
Just as a matter of system while we're building sites, I mean, I've learned that, you know, not over 95% of the pictures on your site will never be displayed over a 900 pixel size.
Right.
So,
well, the size of the display is controlled by your theme, right? So, you know, if your theme says that photos in, you know, featured images, for example, display at 600 by 900, and that's the biggest image that you show anywhere on your site, then it would be a waste to have any image in your library bigger than that.
correct.
Right.
But what a lot of people do is they'll just upload these 1920.
Oh, absolutely they will.
images, and then they'll use WordPress or something to just.
And that's where the problem comes from.
That doesn't actually do anything because you're still loading the full size of the image.
From a performance perspective, it's terrible because you're downloading huge quantities of stuff that you're not using, and you're also using server resources, or maybe it's workstation resources. I'm not even sure at this point, to do the resizing. When WordPress resizes that image, I think it's done by PHP in the server, but you know, so it actually you know, is wasting time sending you that smaller image.
So my question would be, aren't you kind of just getting rid of the whole using compression plugins? It's just by your practices, you're not uploading any, you know, pictures.
Okay, the size of the image is a big piece of how big the image is, right? A 600 by 900 version of this photo is going to be a lot smaller than a 2000 by 3000 version of the same image. But each of those can be compressed to be quite a bit smaller yet, right? Remember the page we had earlier here with the numbers, right? The first number up here, this 3.2 megs, this is how big it was before I did anything. When I compressed it and didn't make the size different, it dropped it to 366. Instead of compressing it, if I change the size, if I scale it, I don't get quite as much of an improvement, but I haven't lost any of the image quality, and I can still compress it after I've made it smaller, right? After I've resized the scale, I can then compress that and go from this 750K down to 55K. And I couldn't see the difference between 55K, 750K, and 3.2 megs. Now, I don't know if you went a little further, whether it would start to show. Maybe you could go a little further and get even more out of it. Maybe you care more about quality. Maybe your eye is more discerning than mine. Maybe your customers are. You don't want to go quite that far. Maybe you only want to go down to the next level here. You want to go to the 71K, or you want to go to the 111K. That's still a hell of a lot better than 750K. Right, so you want to do the resizing, which is called scaling, like if you do it in GIMP or Photoshop, and you can tell your plugin that does the that does the compression as well. Most of them also will make the changes size-wise. You can tell it what sizes to make it, or it'll look in your theme and figure out, okay, you use 3 different image sizes, maybe it'll make all 3 copies, and then only load the one that's pertinent on that particular page. But you want to do both. Now, it may be the case when your client gives you a bunch of images, maybe they did the compression already, and maybe they made them, maybe they scaled them to the right size already. But my guess is that rarely happens. That rarely happens, and never is probably more accurate even yet. So you're going to wind up doing this stuff. And if you're building a brand new website, you're only putting 3-4 pages on it, you can do it all manual, and it's not an issue at all because it just isn't that much work. But if you've got an existing website and you want to make it better, it's a lot of work to go grab all those images, redo them, change the names, put them back in the, but you want a plugin to do it for you. Yes?
Are you saying when you're downsizing these images, optimizing them, 72 dpi is always your aim?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, those kinds of decisions are up to you. You control. It depends on how your website's used, what it's for. If you have a photography website and you want to have maximum quality and you want to display big versions of the images and you care immensely about quality because your customers are going to care, then you want to do it different. You want to use lossless compression, but you still probably want to right size the image. If the biggest you display it on your screen is a 900 by 1200, let's say, then you certainly don't want to be downloading a 4K by 6K image, right? That's 12 megabytes. You don't want to waste that space.
I'm just asking specifically because I do download some images that are 90 dpi.
I don't know enough about the underlying technology to tell you whether you can. I think there are applications that will upscale images. But my understanding from what I've read, not my personal experience, is that upscaling doesn't usually work very well. And you wind up with a crappy version, even if it has more dots per inch.
I'm assuming that somebody uploaded a 90 dpi.
If there's one available, starting with the best one is almost always the best. It guarantees you the best result, right? Start with the best quality image you can get, no matter how big it is. Because it's no harder to scale a 10 megabyte file than it is to scale a 500K file. Right? It's the same process. You tell it how big you want it to be, and it does the scaling, right? But you'll get a slightly better result if you start with the best possible image, right? Because every little imperfection, right, or degradation or whatever you want to call it, that's in the smaller one, it's like a photocopy. You make a photocopy, you can make 1,000 photocopies of the original. They all look great. But if you make a copy, and then you make a copy of a copy, and then you make a copy of that copy, and you make a copy, you don't have to make very many before it's crap. You can hardly even read it, because every little imperfection just gets magnified, right? Same thing is true if you don't start with the very best. We out of questions? Okay, yes, go ahead. I don't know about Jim, but I'm here as long as you want to ask questions.
We can't be here later than 8:30, regardless.
Okay, well, it's only 8 o'clock. If you want to ask more questions, go ahead. Unless you have something else you want to do.
No, I'm just going to start wrapping up some of that and go over the second.
Okay.
So is it enough to do all the compression of image file size in Photoshop, or is there something that you cannot do in Photoshop but then you can do in a plugin?
I don't think there's anything you can do in a plugin that you can't do in Photoshop, but plugins can automate the process, all right? They can do the resizing, they can do the compression all at once, they can do it in bulk. When you do it in Photoshop or GIMP or some other, web-based tool, there's a bunch of them, then you do them one at a time, and you make your decision. You can do them differently. You can compress this one at 80%, you can compress this one at 60%, you can compress this one at 40%, depending on your results. But, unless you have a really good eye, you're not going to see much difference until you get, way low on the scale. The underlying technology that does the compression is pretty much the same in all of these. There are slight differences. Some are a little better than others. If you read some of the different, there's probably 500 articles just last year about image compression on the web, because it's a really big deal. So a lot of people write about it. And some of them will review, 2, 3, 10 programs, and they'll take an image and they'll compress it in each one of those applications. And they start with 3.2 megs maybe, or 300K, or whatever the image was to begin with, and then they'll compress it. They'll typically compress them all at a particular compression level. And then, okay, this one compressed 59%, this one compressed 52%, this one was 61, this one was what. But, product A will win with this image. Product B will win with this image. Product C will win with this image here. They're not as far apart as they show up in the various results. And one way to verify that that's true is when you read 3 different reviews by 3 different writers that all use the same applications, they get different results. And this guy says this one's the best in terms of performance, in terms of the actual size at the end, right? And then somebody else says, no, it's this one here. I get much better compression. They tested one file. You can't learn anything, right? Or you can't learn enough with one file. But it's too much work to do 30 different files and get an average and publish that, right? So they don't do it. I mean, Yes, Jim?
DPIs. 72 DPIs for the web. 300 is for print.
No, I know all those. I do.
Yeah.
But I do catch some websites.
What, 396?
I download the photo,
Some
look
will
at
do
it,
it, yeah.
and it's 80 DPI, 90 DPI.
It's probably just recalculating it on the compression portion. The main thing is that you never want to go less than 72, but you can start at 72 for the web, but that's still a misnomer because a TV does a certain DPI, a Mac does a certain DPI, a Windows does a certain DPI. And when you're dealing with stuff like, sometimes your clients may have a 32-inch monitor.
Take that.
Yeah, they're looking at everything on a 32-inch monitor, and you're going to have to start doing like retina images on your website. But the thing is that that's all handled in your CSS, is that you look at your viewport and you say, does this person have a 32-inch, with viewport, and then I'm going to deliver a 4x retina screen.
But even people that have 32-inch monitors don't necessarily use them to look at one web page. They might put 5 or 6 or 10 different things on that same monitor all at once, right? Because they're just looking at going back and forth between all these different things. It makes their work easier. They're not necessarily expecting to blow everything up this big so that they can see it. Because the minute they do that, they're going to see all the flaws on everybody's web page, and they're going to go, man, this looks crappy, right? Because most people aren't going to have super high quality retina images at
the CEO who got 32-inch monitor.
well, yeah, but he's only going to do that a couple of times and go, wait a minute, this looks crappy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I have one of those.
So, it depends on who your customers are and what kind of stuff you're showing, right? And because that changes the mix of what the customers expect. If you have a photography website where you sell high quality photographs, then almost all your customers are going to want to see high quality images on your website. But if that's not what you're doing, if you have a news site or you have a blog, most of your customers want to see a decent version of an image. They don't want to see blur. They don't want to see, crap. But, they won't be able to tell the difference typically between the various different compression levels unless you go, berserk on it. And so, you're much better off getting the benefit of the improved performance than you are having an image that's better in theory, but not in practice.
And when you start rotating images and like doing like color overlays and doing like the background overlays over your image, the quality of the image can go way down.
Yeah.
You can practically do a black and white image sometimes. Yeah, it just depends.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't ruin an image with compression, but you got to compress it a heck of a lot for a typical image. Like I said, this website here, this example here, I just took a picture of my great-grandson and used that. And I couldn't tell the difference between 55K and 3.2 megs on a monitor where I was looking at the picture at a reasonable size. I didn't blow it up this big, but I'm not saying that no one could see a difference. I'm saying in typical use, I couldn't see a difference, and I don't think most people will. Because typically, they're not that, they don't care that much about the images you're likely to use in a blog, right? But if you're buying a photo, they care a whole lot. And so they pay a lot more attention, and they're much more likely to see detail that maybe you wouldn't see in a smaller version. Yes?
For the compression, you already talked about how important it is to test things to see how it performs on your server for your product. I have a big client revamping their website, 20 years old, it's got over 300 images on it. So it seems like a good idea. But how can you test it without damaging the images the next time you want to try two different things?
Well, one thing you can do, we talked earlier about development sites, right? A development version, you can have in some hosting at some product levels, they'll offer you, one-click staging, right? So you hit a button, boom, you have a copy of a staging site, and it's got everything on there and then you play with the staging site and say, oh, this is great, look how much I got, and blah, 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 or no, I didn't get any, or you can, test 3 or 4 different products and see which one you like. If you don't have staging on your server, then you can set up a local copy of WordPress in your PC. You can back up your website. Jim talked about that last week or a couple weeks ago. You pop down a copy to your local PC and you do all your testing there, and you find the product you like, you learn how to use it, you install it on a server, and away you go. Looks like we're done. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, John.
You bet.